Welcome, everybody. My name is Gregory Pfeiffer. I am the director of the Institute of Common World Affairs. Thank you very much for coming tonight when you could be protesting in front of the Capitol against possible firing of Robert Mueller. 10 years ago, I was an NPR reporter in Moscow and just finishing a book about the Soviet war in Afghanistan. That's just about the time that President Obama was announcing that he was going to ramp up the US-led campaign in Afghanistan. It was also the time when US-Russia relations were rapidly deteriorating, and a lot of the Soviet veterans to whom I was speaking were eager to see the US fail. In fact, the the US conflict, the new conflict, was added to the slights that the Russians felt that the Americans were committing against Moscow. We know Afghanistan far better than anyone else, and no one is consulting us, which really seemed absurd on the face of it to me at the time. How could the two campaigns possibly be compared? Thankfully, I don't have to answer that question. John Caldwell can. In his new book, Anatomy of Victory, he addresses the deep roots of the American failure on the battlefield in the past several decades. And he addresses how to address it.
So I think the first place to start is, where did this book begin? It is so very important, I think, to understand why an author came to the subject that they came to, and how it became important in their life, important enough to write a book about it. So first, let me say congratulations. John, it is a tremendous accomplishment. Your book is extraordinary. And I'm sure you and Jeff will enjoy this sort of reminiscence.
Well, thank you. In March of 1968, my first real job began in Saigon, actually. And I was working for a company in Goleta, California called General Research Corporation. They had a contract with the Advanced Research Projects Agency. I think a sole source contract. If there are people in this audience who know about Pentagon procurements, I don't know quite how that happened, but it did. And I was part of a research team of about 9 people. My boss was a retired Marine Corps colonel with a Silver Star from the Chosin Reservoir operation. So he had a certain amount of credibility with the MACV types that we quickly met when we arrived in Saigon. A week into this experience, I meet this gentleman sitting on my left, Jeffrey Race, and the conversation begins with, why are you here, what are you doing? And I figured out that he had come back to Vietnam as a civilian, was hoping to get some kind of a stipend, I think, from the State Department, maybe wandered through the CIA, it wasn't clear, but he hadn't gotten it yet. And we were sort of chatting, and of course I was thinking, maybe we ought to hire this guy as a consultant to help us, since he seems to know a lot more about what's going on here than I seem to. And then he says to me, John, we're going to lose this war. And I said, my God, Jeffrey, how can you make a statement like that? I mean, look around you. We've got military bases all around the Saigon area. We've got 550,000 people here. We've got aircraft carriers offshore that can fly to any point in the country 24/7. We've got 1,700 aircraft dedicated to the theater. How could we lose? I mean, even if the shooting were to stop tomorrow. And by the way, we were losing 350 men a week there. If the shooting were to stop tomorrow, it would take us 5 years to pack up and go home. There's so much stuff here. And he just levelly looks at me straight in the eye and says, John, our enemies have a theory of victory, and we don't. It was that simple. And that has stuck with me for 50 years.
How do we then end up with so much failure with respect to Vietnam?
So the answer is both simple and complex. The simple part of the answer is that the people who conceived the effort in Vietnam had no idea how that place worked. They simply did not understand, I mean, we're talking scientific terms, it was a black box. They didn't understand the input-output relationships. And so, since they didn't understand how the place worked, that is to say, that society and what were the issues, they did the wrong things in response, and I'll talk about that in a second. And because most of the things they did were violent things, they got into a death spiral because they created more enemies than they did away with. And so it had to come to a bad end, and this is what John says I told him in 1968, that it was just clear that we were up against people who had a very good plan. Okay, and we had no plans. But if there's various kinds of random violence or organized violence in many different places, you can't predict them, you can't concentrate your forces everywhere. So there's a logical contradiction in the basis of American military doctrine in a war such as was fought in Vietnam.
We were in the business of trying to change behaviors of a host nation, the Vietnamese. And yet these were people about whom we understood very little. In a cultural and historical sense. How were we going to motivate them to assume the risk of death? A question Jeffrey posed to me a number of times when we were in Southeast Asia. How do we get people to assume the risk of death who really don't have that strong a personal motivation to do it? And yet our adversaries were prepared to do that at extraordinarily courageous levels of blood and sacrifice. So it was a different kind of conflict, and we really hadn't done the kind of homework that was necessary or given ourselves the kind of preparation that was necessary. And most of all, we couldn't identify a critical national interest that mattered. There was no resource we needed from Vietnam. There was no mineral product we needed. There was talk maybe of, offshore oil, but none of that really mattered. There was no strategic national interest. Why were we there? We never could figure out to ourselves what that meant.
There are a couple of missteps, unfortunately, made in Afghanistan, which lead all of us, the Afghan government, the international community, not to win the war. A few mistakes are enough to lose the entire war. Technically, the first point, which is very important, is lack of continuity. The US forces, the NATO, international forces, they deploy in Afghanistan. They are there for 7 or 8 months. The first few months, you have to spend to know the culture, to know the area, to know the geography, to know the people that you work with, and how you work with. And then you are protected for a month and 2, and then you are getting ready to pack and come back home. It continued for the past 18 years. At least you have to be there for 2 or 3 years. The second thing is that United States going to Afghanistan, one soldier of the United States cost $1 million. Why we are not building the national and local capacities? The Afghan national forces that can address today's challenges and the future challenges. United States cannot be 911 of the country to call and come. Or the United States cannot police the country in the region. The other important thing is that we need to define winning of war. What do we mean by winning of war? We need to define that. What I think is that defeating your enemy and then installing a democratic-based government there, and the people to take the lead and to have a well-established government there in place, and then you win the war. Other than that, you haven't. In case of Afghanistan, we still have a bad government, unfortunately. The leaders of the country, they are committed, they are dedicated for having a peaceful and developed country. But because of the nefarious elements there, the leadership, they do not have the power to tackle this problem.
Ever since 1976 and Jimmy Carter talking about how he was a peanut farmer, we have been successfully electing presidents who claimed they were outsiders. And what is even more insane about this logic, from my perspective, is that with each president, we have chosen somebody less experienced or more further outside the system. So we're now at a place where we have a president who doesn't have a respect for, a knowledge of, or an interest in politics, or for that matter, really anything related to war. Machiavelli said very simply, a prince should do nothing but study war. Nothing but that. None of our politicians make that a focus of their interest. Most of them are interested in marketing and messaging and what it means to win the day at the journalistic level. So I would argue that the failure of leadership is also a failure of our public to recognize that experience matters.